Hello, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Joining us today is Dr. Stephanie Savell, the co-director of the Cost of War Project at Brown University, to discuss the rise of military coups across the West African Sahel region. Dr. Savell, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Of course, I was going to begin today's conversation by talking about the recent coup in Niger, but just this morning, the Central African country of Gabon just had their also had a military coup where they dissolved all institutions of the government and claimed that the newly elected president, I mean, he's not newly elected because he was president before this, who just won the third term, is not a legitimate president. But I'm going to go back to, I want to begin to this conversation with Niger, where the democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum was overthrown and detained by his own presidential guards, along with many of his top political allies being arrested. And this comes after a spree of other military coups across the region. We have namely Mali, Bamako, Guinea-Conakry, Burkina Faso, Chad, Jamena, and now Gabon, making this, if successful, the 8th or 9th coup in the region. So really living up to its name as the coup belt of the world.
At this point, it is, yeah.
So knowing all of this, I want to hear your take on what is happening in the region. And I want to touch on some historical and contemporary factors that are contributing to these coups in the region.
Yeah. Well, it's, it's a very, why is it happening? First of all, I think one of the major factors is that this, especially the young generation in this region, is coming to terms with what it means to have been colonized. And it's, it's an educated generation, although there are many people still who lack access to education, but there are many more university students and people who've learned about the history of what their countries have gone through.
Right.
And there's a lot of rage. So I was in Niger, and I pronounce it Niger because it's the French pronunciation. Yeah. That's the colonial language in Niger. So I spoke with a group of university students who were talking about how there's been, the kind of spate of terror attacks at their country's borders. And they were talking about their own peaceful protests in the streets of Niamey. And they were saying, we are young people. We're not that different from the young people who are in these Islamist militant groups. Right. We're all did I freeze? We're all, can you hear me? Okay.
You're back.
We're all just trying to do the same thing, which is really fight against injustice and really say that we deserve better, and we deserve to have state services, and we deserve to have jobs. And there are so many global systems that are keeping us repressed. And so they were equating this kind of militant movement and these terror attacks that we've been seeing across the West Africa region, at least, with this really just this kind of absolutely, I think of the region as just kind of roiling with this anti-colonial sentiment and just this reverberation. So what happens with the military coups is, it's very clear that who benefits from these coups. It's the leaders of the coups, right? There's no kind of trickle-down effect so far that anyone has been able to see, although perhaps you can speak, I don't know the situation of Guinea, and maybe it's different there. But for the most part, these are the people who are profiting. And yet they're able to mobilize popular sentiment because the administrations that were in power are seen as allied with the former colonial power, in this case of Niger, the French. And so there's so much hatred of France that people are willing to kind of get behind whatever change of the status quo that promises a different path. Right. So I think that's kind of where we see some of the popular sentiment. It's where certainly in Niger, there's been a lot of press around, people waving Russian flags. It's not necessarily because there's some kind of allegiance with Russia. It's more because people are ready to do whatever it takes to kind of stick it to France,
Right.
So.
And also, like, I want to touch on the fact that these sentiments towards France are not unfounded, right?
No.
For generations, France has been taking advantage of the resources of these countries. In Niger, France controls ultimately almost all of the uranium that's in the country, and they have built extractive institutions in these countries that are designed to take resources from them and take it to France. I
And
was
so it's global capitalism,
right,
it's neocolonialism in that sense. And it's also, a big thing is the kind of reverberating
right,
power structures.
right,
So the French, like they ruled the peoples of West Africa in a certain way, such that they kind of pitted different ethnic groups against each other, and they put certain groups in power, like in control of government, and others became very marginalized because they were not like kind of used by the French through, their system of indirect rule. So the kind of legacies of a lot of the tensions and political rivalries between different people, between different groups, it's basically all messed up
right.
because of the role that France played during the colonial period.
Exactly. And even like even beyond like the Russian flags that you see, those also for me can be explained in the sense that right now the relationship that French has with their former colonies is very much exploitative. Not only in Niger but in Guinea, the bauxite mines are owned by foreigners. The cocoa plants across the Ivory Coast, every sort of natural resource that you could think of is owned primarily by foreigners,
Yeah.
and the
Although,
local.
yeah,
Right,
go
sorry.
ahead. I mean, it's changing, right? So,
Right.
so it used to be that France had kind of this stranglehold on the regional economies of its
Right.
former colonies. That has actually changed in recent years, and I think that the Chinese have made big inroads in a lot of they've gotten a lot of concessions to mines and natural resources, and other countries have kind of come in to the picture, and France
Right.
has there's a diminishing share, but certainly not in the popular imagination.
Right. And I think that's also where the new sentiments and frustration about like the nature of relationship with former colonial powers either have to change or they have to leave. Because now some of the countries have started seeing that historically France had there is a belief that historically France has prevented them from building ties with other countries, or when they have leaders that are seen as puppets of former colonial powers, those leaders prevent them from building ties. But
Mm.
with new ties being built by China and Turkey and other Asian countries coming in and invested in the countries, and diversifying some of the resources that are in a country, there is a sense that if we get rid of these relations, um, we are going to see some form of benefits from the new form of relations being built. Now, that rests to be, we have to wait to see whether that's true or not, because we
Mhm.
still don't know what the ultimate, because everybody is a self-interested, rational self-interested person
Absolutely.
in the
Yeah.
party. And then I want you to touch a little bit on the jihadist, because I was reading where this paper that was talking about the relationship, the popular sentiments for Russia is that Russia has been giving weapons to some of the countries, or selling weapons, heavy machinery weapons to some of the countries in the region, whereas France has been there with 1,500 troops. The U.S. military has a base in Niger and AFRICOM and other countries, but they haven't been seeing much progress in sort of like safeguarding the region and fighting the jihadists. So since Russia has been able to provide them with that support, there's this leaning towards Russian influence and so on. What is your
Yeah.
take on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that that's misleading what you just said, because
Mm,
actually, so I'll go back and explain kind of like how this conflict has kind of really started up, and where all these Islamist, terror attacks are coming from. But I do want to respond to the fact that, Russia may be providing certain kinds of weapons to countries in the region, but the U.S. has provided far more, and in terms like of scale of equipment and funding, the U.S. is, in Niger alone since 2012, the U.S. has spent $500 million in what the U.S. government calls security assistance, which is not really assistance in fighting the problem, but that's what the official category is called. So yeah, so there's and the French have been very active in training, providing on the ground troops, doing funding as well, as have many other players, right? So when I spoke to members of the military in Burkina Faso, Niger, some of the other countries, they're very clear that they kind of get what they want to from each of the different foreign powers, right? So they're saying, oh, the Chinese, like it's like they send, someone joked like, oh, they sent like a Google or Amazon catalog of all the weapons you can get, and then you can just pick out what you want, and it's like super cheap, but then they break, like the bulletproof vests don't even block any bullets, so that was kind of so they kind of were joking around and like stereotyping each of the foreign players for like what they had to offer in terms of this kind of war on terror fight, so what they said was that the US in terms of scale of funding was by far and above like any other foreign player was US funding. So basically what's happened in the region. So in 2011, NATO ousted Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya. Gaddafi had a bunch of mercenaries working for him, and when he was ousted, there was all these like weapons stores and fighters kind of roaming about in the desert, and this is a region that I've learned is I'm talking about the Sahel and the Sahara region. So the Sahel is this kind of band of like more desert type scrub brush topography, and the Sahara, of course, is the actual like fine sand desert, right? The borders are between the countries Libya, Algeria, Niger, Mali. They're very porous because it's just kilometers upon kilometers of open desert. So the groups that are in these regions are kind of going in between countries very easily, and at the time, right after Gaddafi was ousted, there was a rebel movement in Mali, a separatist movement, which still exists, Azawad. And the separatists joined together with some of these mercenaries who were coming from Libya, who had all these guns. And at the same time, some of the groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda from the Middle East started sending some fighters into this kind of like increasingly chaotic mix. And the Islamist groups kind of quickly gained the upper hand over the separatist movements, and started taking territory in northern Mali in 2012, 2013. And the French at the time and the West were concerned that this conflict would spill over into the broader region, as indeed it has. And the French launched Operation Barkhane, which was a military operation to kind of stem the tide of the conflict. The U.S. has been really involved. There was a UN mission in Mali, a peacekeeping mission that recently got kicked out by the military government. So there were, there were lots of kind of Western actors kind of involved in trying to stop. And what we've seen in the past 5 years or so is that Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger have just kind of suffered increasing amounts of Islamist militant attacks. And what they do is they attack mostly like government forces, but also civilians. Like there's a good bit of kind of economic piracy that's going on. So people are claiming the mantle of these Islamist groups, but then in practice, what they're actually doing is going in and stealing people's cattle and other kinds of livelihood sources. And there's a lot of smuggling of drugs and other kinds of goods that's involved. So it's a kind of a lot of people join the militant groups out of economic necessity, as well as the majority join because of kind of the need to retaliate. Increasingly, the government forces crack down on a particular ethnic group, calling them terrorists. The Fulani or Peul group, which is a group of herders. Are you a member of? Yeah, right. They've practiced Islam for centuries, as you know, and they are discriminated against by governments across the region. And then the government cracks down on the Fulani, and then the Fulani, some people are joining the militant groups to retaliate against the government. So it becomes a cycle. And what I've shown in my work is that the US, by creating this kind of war on terror narrative and sending in the equipment and the funding and the training to kind of prop up that narrative, has really contributed to intensifying this cycle of blowback. The US is not like a major player in this region, but it has really imported this kind of, what do you do when there's a terror attack? Oh, you fight it with a war as if there were an enemy, and that comes with its own repercussions. There are many other ways of dealing with terror attacks. You could treat it as a criminal justice problem, which, that has its own, policing has its own problems, but still it's a very different way of looking at the situation. You could think about long-term solutions. This is, these are movements also that are very much at the fundamental kind of driving level, are rooted in structural problems of poverty, people, food insecurity, basically like people not having enough to eat, and people's frustration with government corruption. Climate change is a factor, and the fact that there's changing patterns of land use and desertification. This is one of the regions that's gotten hit hardest by climate change. So herders and farmers are coming into conflict more and more. So there's all these structural,
there's so many layers to unpack that it's like, it's going to take more than one conversation to unpack all the
absolutely. And then the government forces are going in and they're treating it as like, oh, this is a war on the bad guy, on the state enemies, on the bad, so quote unquote bad guys, and that's just making the whole thing worse.
Right. And then you just recently published an article where you mentioned that at least 5 of the Coupsters have been trained by the U.S. military. Could you say a little bit more about that article, and how should us in the West, why should we care about what's happening down there? What stake do we have in this?
Right. Well, that actually wasn't my article. Some other people have shown that the people, but it's a trend across the region, all across West Africa, to a T. Every country that's had a coup, there's been people who've been trained by the U.S. military who are leading the coup. And partly, I think the reason is that the U.S. trains so many of the top military leaders in all of these countries in the name of counterterrorism. So that's, just kind of one reason, is just scale. The other is that there was a UNDP study that showed that the countries that are more likely to have an ongoing pattern of recurring coups are countries where there's been a history of military coups. For Niger, this is the 5th military coup since independence in the 1960s, right? So this is there's a trend,
right, historically,
and countries that have an over-involvement of the military in political life. There's an imbalance, a kind of skewed over importance that the military has in determining political outcomes. And that is something that the US contributes to perpetuating by funneling all of these hundreds of millions of dollars. I always say it's like a drop in the bucket. The Pentagon budget is over $700 billion a year. The US sends $500 million to a country like Niger. That's nothing for the Pentagon. Nothing. For Niger, it's a lot. So
Right.
it's an imbalance.
Right. And before we move on, I want to give credit to the right scholars that wrote the article, or that at least five of the people
Yeah,
um, have been trained by the U.S. military. It was by the Intercept, and you commented
that's
uh,
right. Yeah, that's right.
on how. Okay. So shout out to those scholars that wrote that. University student here, big on plagiarism. But moving on from that, another phenomenon that I wanted you to comment on was I was in Guinea post the when Mamadou Doumbouya ousted Alpha Conde, the president that was there before the coup, the recent coup in Guinea. And what I saw usually when coups happen, because Guinea, like Niger, has a history of coups happening throughout its history, but that has always been marked by violence and ethnic conflict. However, this time around, it was marked by celebration in the streets.
Yeah,
And in Niger, it was also marked by celebration in some areas.
American.
Gabon, we also see in some areas there's celebration. And in Mali, there were videos of like people in front of the French embassy, just telling them to leave. And in Niger, the same thing. In Burkina Faso, they're even more nationalist than like the rest of the region, I would argue. So I want to get your take on this because I haven't been seeing it highlighted in a lot of the Western media that's being
Yeah.
that like the celebration that's coming from like the region about like all the coups, which sort of leaves us wondering, is this the future of the region?
Yeah.
If so, like a lot of the leaders in the region should be panicking right now.
Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a tendency in the US to assume that democracy and the US way is the good way and other kinds of government are the wrong way. There's the very much, this is very much the discourse. And yet, when you see the track record of authoritarian governments in Africa and elsewhere, you see systems that may work well for some people, especially people with, who are more elite, and that really oppresses and represses and kills and, abuses the human rights and civil rights of the people who are at the bottom of the ladder. So when I was doing my research in Niger, people were just saying what a great job Niger was doing. It was so stable. I mean, that's one of the ironies, is, as you were mentioning earlier, like the claim was that, oh, the government's not doing a good enough job fighting this, jihadist insurgency. And so the military has to step in, run the government and do it better. Right. But at the time, Niger is doing far better than its neighbors. And people are saying, oh, such a great government's doing such a great job promoting peace, blah, blah, blah. And then I started I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I can't just take the word of the people who are in power. Like, I need to kind of seek out, what is the story? Like, how does the story work if you are a Fulani person, if you are a Black Tuareg person, for example, because there's another nomadic group that had the former slaves of this ethnic group are now incorporated. They're called Tuaregs, but they were slaves back in the day, and so they're the Black Tuareg. They are also, subjects of a lot of discrimination and prejudice. And so I started seeking out these kinds of people, like, what's your version of what's going on? And they were talking about being indiscriminately shot at by the army for riding a motorcycle, because there were these zones of emergency where riding a motorcycle is prohibited. Well, what if you're like, needing a hospital and that's your only mode of transportation, as it is in a lot of these places, right? So, or for example, fishing was prohibited in one of the lake regions of Niger. So all of a sudden people couldn't earn a living and couldn't have, a food source. People were being jailed for activism and journalism. There's, free speech was like non-existent, right? So this is all in the context of a supposed democracy with authoritarian leanings that, by the way, the US overlooked, to call it such a great, stable security partner, right? But that's what happens in dictatorships, and that's what happens in, you know, when there's a military-led government, because there's no need to be accountable to any kind of notion of human rights, right? So I think we, you know, so why the popular support? I mean, that's just, I think, a fascinating question to investigate. It's akin to what I've found in a totally different research project in Brazil, where, you know, the kind of like poor people, Black people who are living in favelas, the poor neighborhoods, are all about, you know, hardcore policing and like heavy-handed policing, right? Sometimes, not everyone, obviously, that's a huge generalization, but like there is this surprising sentiment where like, what, you know,
why would you ever
coming
support
from, right? And I kind of see this support for military governments in this West African region in a similar light as it's kind of puzzling, right? Like you see the support for these regimes amongst the very people who are probably most likely to suffer from the crackdown. It's a kind of populism, right? And I think people are still trying to like unpack that and understand it. Personally, you know, as an anthropologist, I often see when I talk to people around the world a kind of a nostalgia for a rosy, but like the pass through rosy colored glasses kind of thing, where like basically anything is better than the current state in which you're absolutely suffering from massive injustice, right? So anything looks kind of better.
And I think like also we can't ignore like historical precedents of like the French or foreign powers sort of have like almost next to zero legitimacy in those countries to try to be like, listen, you want democracy, you don't want a military rule, you're not going to benefit from this. People won't listen because they have historical precedents of Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah and all their leaders who they saw as like the mentors of freedom and liberty being murdered by the West. So then it's like you can't come back generations later and try to preach and teach and, you know, try to bring democracy when you thwarted it in the beginning.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, that leads me to my next question. We know that the people who benefit most are the people in power, the people in search of power. Nonetheless, this phenomenon is happening. It is the coup belt of the world. What is the long-term implications of this for regular people on the ground, the people that you interviewed and so on? And to add to that, since we're nearing the end, threats of military intervention by ECOWAS. Can you give us your insights on that as well?
Yeah. No, I think that's the most important question to ask, because who suffers from this sort of stuff? Like, who suffers from war and conflict and authoritarianism? It's kind of like the everyday people, everyday citizens are the ones who suffer most. I met a community of displaced people in Burkina Faso. I met a lot of displaced people. One community that I got to know a little bit was, you know, they were living in an abandoned school building on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the capital. They only ate once a day. This was mostly women, some and children, a few men, older men. And they only ate once a day due to the charity of the surrounding villages, who already were people who kind of face food insecurity. So it was the generosity of people who don't have enough to eat to begin with. It might be millet, it might be rice if they were lucky. It was nothing else. So there was a little boy who they had taken to the doctor because he had malaria. They managed to kind of like scramble around, collect enough money for the doctor's fee. But by the time they got him to the doctor for malaria, which is a very common illness, it was too late. He was so anemic, so like he had so few nutrients from the food deprivation that he died of malaria, and which is a very treatable disease if you catch it on time and you're not malnourished. So, that story really stays with me because it shows the reverberating consequences of war. It's not necessarily that people die in violence. The 4 times as many people on average die of the reverberating effects, like not having enough to eat, not having access to healthcare, in the environmental causes, right? So it's really awful and sad, and the thought of ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is the what is it? Economic Community
of West African
of
countries.
West African states, right? So they've threatened to intervene militarily to reinstate President Bazoum to power in Niger, if the junta doesn't do so, which the junta does not seem like it's going to. And, people have kind of said, oh, this is an empty threat. They're not doing anything. If they don't do anything, though, it lays the groundwork for any other country in the region to have a coup, as we saw in Gabon, right? Their people are empowered because they know that nothing's going to happen if they do. I mean, that's a generalization as well, because there's sanctions, and in Niger actually people don't have electricity and water, and there's all kinds of sanctions by ECOWAS that's really affecting people, and think about how it affects the kind of most marginalized as well. But then from a different perspective, I mean, I'm someone who studies the trauma and the suffering caused by war, right? And so when I look at the possibility of an ECOWAS military intervention in Niger, what I see is a situation in which there's a war that's going to start, because Burkina Faso and Mali have said that they would support Niger militarily if ECOWAS invades. And so it would be absolutely devastating. I mean, I just can't even begin to fathom the horrors of that in a region where people are already suffering so much.
Yeah. And I think too often we tend to romanticize and glamorize the idea of like liberators, freedom fighters, the hell with neocolonialism, the hell with the French, the hell with, power structures that are not serving us. So, let's engage in this conflict, forgetting that too often it is the people at the top who are benefiting from the conflict, and it is at the people at the bottom who are dying from it. It is the people at the bottom who are sending their kids to fight in these wars.
Yeah.
The people who have nothing to eat, who are on the streets protesting and speaking up. So either way, no matter how you look at it, they're clear losers in the situation, and it is not the ones at the top of it. So we need to recognize that as well, while also holding these power structures accountable in the process. But while we come to the end, I wanted to get your one last take about how you think these events are going to unfold, or how you hope they'll unfold. And we hope to keep these conversations going, because clearly with what we've seen this morning with Gabon, this is not the end of the story. There is so much more to come.
It's really just, the prospects don't look good, and that's it's just, I hate to think about that, but it's true. When it comes to what I hope for, I think that one of the amazing things about my visit to Niger in January was that I saw people from the very small local neighborhood level all the way up to someone who was working with the federal government, with kind of grassroots or models of peace building and conflict resolution that made so much sense in the local context and seemed to be making a difference at the local level, And so people were in Burkina Faso. There's been examples of municipal governments negotiating ceasefires with some of the Islamist militant groups, because and it actually worked. So it's something that I think, with the narrative of a war on terror, we have to fight jihadists with a war, the alternative is to say, well, what are the local solutions? What are people saying that actually could bring peace, and support those. I was speaking to someone who used to work in the government in Niger, and he was saying to me, at this point, Bazoum is he would have no support, no legitimacy, even if he were to be reinstated into the presidency. So at this point, what do we to promote peace? He had all kinds of ideas, like, let's tell the junta to have an open election soon and let Bazoum run. And then, and so he kind of had all these ideas that I could totally see, this is someone who knows all the ins and outs of all the different kind of political rivalries and ethnic tensions. And he was kind of proposing a path forward. And I was like, this is the person who should be figuring out what to do, not anyone from the outside. And I think that what foreign powers can do is really support those kinds of local ideas by people who know what they're talking about.
Dr. Savell, it's been great having you on Let's Just Talk, and we hope to continue doing this work with you and continue the conversation.
Yeah,
thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, great to talk to you.